The survival grounds of the Galactic Academy stretched far beyond what most cadets had expected when they first volunteered for the course. The terrain was a mixture of cracked stone, thin forest cover, and streams that twisted through valleys like silver threads. It was meant to simulate a hostile frontier world where survival depended not on advanced equipment, but on instinct, adaptability, and the ability to work with others. On the first day, the instructors had confiscated most of the cadets' technology, leaving them with only basic rations, canteens, and a short list of objectives. For most of the alien cadets, the loss of familiar equipment was a heavy blow, and frustration festered quickly. To them, survival without sensors or energy shields was close to impossible. The human cadet, however, had shown no panic when the confiscations occurred. He had simply adjusted the strap on his canteen, shifted his pack on his shoulder, and stepped into the field with a calm expression that unsettled the others. The resentment had begun almost immediately. He was different, not only because of his species, but because of his composure. The other cadets whispered that he walked as if the ground itself posed no threat, that his eyes measured distances with unnatural precision, and that his silence felt like arrogance. The alien group consisted of 6 species, each with its own pride and traditions. The crystalline Urvath considered endurance a birthright. The scaled Dravek believed cunning outweighed strength. The feathered Osili prided themselves on quick thinking, and the others held similar views of superiority. Yet none could ignore the way the human blended into the environment with ease. On the first night, when wind swept down from the ridges and extinguished their fire, he had calmly built another by striking rocks and coaxing sparks into dry moss. That display had planted a seed of irritation that grew with every passing hour. By the third day, it was not simply irritation, but open envy. The cadets whispered while foraging, watching him drink from the stream without hesitation. When one of the Osili suggested that perhaps the human had secret reserves of food or hidden knowledge, the idea quickly transformed into suspicion. To test him, several cadets devised a plan that was equal parts cruel and reckless. Near the edge of the camp, under the shade of broad-leaved trees, a Drevek cadet pried open a leather pouch. Inside was a cluster of dried roots, twisted and sharp, their pale color almost white in the fading sunlight. The Dravek explained in a hushed tone that the root came from a local plant that produced toxins when boiled or soaked. For his species, the root caused only mild sickness, but for most others it could incapacitate or even kill. He claimed that the human would never recognize it, that he would drink without suspicion, and that the others would finally see him stumble. The crystalline Urvath tilted her head, refracting the light in sharp angles, and muttered that the idea was foolish, but she did not stop him. The Osili clicked her beak softly and added that humiliation might break his confidence, which would benefit the rest. Slowly, agreement spread among those who gathered, and the plan took shape. They would not kill him, only weaken him, expose him as fragile, or so they convinced themselves. The act itself unfolded in silence. While the human had wandered into the forest to check the traps he had built for small animals, 2 Drevek approached the canteen set among the scattered packs. One held the root, broken into shavings, while the other unscrewed the lid with careful claws. The root fragments were dropped inside, releasing a faint bitterness that mixed with the scent of metal and water. The lid was tightened again, and the canteen was set back in its place as if untouched. The Osili watched from a distance, feathers trembling slightly in the breeze, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. The Urvath stood rigid, pretending disinterest but secretly curious about what would happen. Not one of them considered that the poison might not discriminate, that in their eagerness to strike at the human, they might also doom themselves. The logic of envy had drowned out caution. When the human returned, his steps were steady, his expression unchanged. He carried with him a bundle of vines, clearly intended for snares, and a few flat stones that he tucked near the fire pit. Without a word, he knelt, placed the stones in a circle, and began arranging the vines. His calmness frustrated the others further. They longed for some crack in his composure, some moment of weakness to prove that he was not superior, not unshakable. When he finally reached for his canteen, the quiet tension in the camp deepened. Every gaze followed the movement of his hand, the twist of the lid, and the tilt of the container as he raised it to his lips. The liquid touched his mouth, and he drank deeply, swallowing several gulps before lowering it. A faint grimace crossed his face, subtle but noticeable, as if he had tasted bitterness. He tapped the side of the canteen once, then lifted it again for another swallow. The aliens leaned closer, waiting for him to fall. The Drevek who had supplied the root clenched his claws, ready to smirk when the human's knees buckled. The Osili shifted her wings nervously, half expecting him to collapse instantly. The crystalline Urvath refracted the sunlight more sharply as she leaned forward, fascinated by the possibility of victory. But nothing happened. The human set the canteen down beside his pack, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and resumed adjusting his snares. The silence grew heavy, filled with disbelief. It was impossible, the Drevek muttered under his breath. The poison should have worked by now, at least enough to cause retching or weakness. Yet the human's movements remained precise, his breathing steady, his eyes clear. If anything, he looked more focused than before. Confusion spread like a ripple through the group. Whispers exchanged in low tones, questions passed from one cadet to another. Had the root lost potency? Had the human known and neutralized it somehow? Or was his biology simply resistant to what crippled others? The Drevek insisted he had used enough to sicken an Irvath twice his size. The Osili muttered that perhaps the human's stomach was made of stone, but none dared ask him directly, none dared reveal what they had done. Instead, they watched him in silence, their plan unraveling before their eyes, the certainty of humiliation replaced by unease. The human continued his work, seemingly unaware of the tension, though perhaps he noticed the weight of their stares. He did not confront them, did not accuse, did not even raise his voice. He simply remained steady, calm, and strangely untouchable. For the cadets, the sabotage had been meant to expose weakness. Instead, it had revealed something far more troubling. Resilience they could neither explain nor dismiss. And as the sun dipped lower behind the ridges, the bitterness of envy began to twist into something closer to fear. The silence that had settled over the camp after the human drank from the poisoned canteen did not fade quickly. It lingered through the fading of daylight, through the orange wash of the sky as the sun slipped behind the ridge and into the first cool breath of night. Every cadet kept glancing toward the human, expecting some delayed effect, waiting for him to stumble, clutch his stomach, or collapse into the dirt. Yet hour after hour passed, and he did nothing but continue his quiet, deliberate work. When he finally leaned back against a stone and stared at the rising moons, it was not the look of a man fighting sickness, but of someone measuring the stars for direction. The cadets grew restless, uncertain whether to believe what they had witnessed. The Drevek who had introduced the root sat apart, claws drumming against the ground in frustration. His pride insisted the poison could not fail, yet his eyes betrayed doubt each time he looked at the human. The Osili shifted her wings and muttered to herself, her feathers twitching as if even her own body rejected the confusion. The crystalline Urvath stood still, as unreadable as the fragments of glass that caught moonlight across her shoulders, but her gaze remained fixed on the human. The following morning sharpened the tension. Dew clung to every blade of grass, shimmering in the dawn light, and the cadets stirred with uneasy movements. Hunger gnawed at them, for the rations had already begun to dwindle, and the forest offered little comfort. The human, however, rose before the others and moved with the same calm steadiness. He stretched his arms once, rolled his shoulders, and then drank again from the canteen without hesitation. The moment froze the others. The liquid, steeped with poison that should have crippled him, slid down his throat in plain sight. He swallowed deeply, paused as if tasting bitterness, and then drank again. Not one cadet could reconcile what he had just done. The Drevek clenched his jaw, the Osili tucked her head close to her body, and even the Urvath leaned slightly forward as if straining to perceive a flaw. The human's face gave nothing away except a faint tightening of his mouth, an acknowledgement of the harsh taste. He lowered the canteen, exhaled softly, and walked toward the stream as though nothing were wrong. When he knelt at the water's edge, the cadets followed at a cautious distance. He dipped the canteen into the current, rinsed it, and filled it again. Yet when he returned to the fire pit, he did not drink immediately. Instead, he crouched low, drew a handful of weeds from the ground, and began chewing slowly on the leaves. His jaw moved deliberately, his expression thoughtful, as though he measured every flavor. The sound of tearing fibers and the faint crack of stems carried through the silence, making the cadet's unease even sharper. Once he swallowed, he reached for a piece of charcoal from the remnants of the fire and ground it between his palms. Black dust coated his fingers, and he mixed it with the crushed leaves before licking it clean. The act seemed reckless to the others, almost ritualistic, but his composure left no doubt that he understood exactly what he was doing. By mid-morning, the cadets could no longer restrain their whispers. The Osili finally spoke first, her voice a low hiss to the Drevek. She asked whether the human might have immunity, whether his body simply ignored toxins. The Drevek shook his head sharply and insisted that the poison was universal. He argued that the only possible explanation was that the human had anticipated the sabotage and found a way to protect himself. Yet when pressed, he could not explain how. The crystalline Urvath finally spoke, her tone as sharp as breaking glass. She said the human had not shown surprise or anger, only a faint recognition when he first drank, as if the bitterness confirmed what he already suspected. That thought unsettled the group more than anything. If he had known and chosen to drink anyway, then he had turned their plot into his own test. The human gave no indication that he had heard their whispers, but his movements suggested awareness. He collected vines, stripped bark from thin branches, and tied knots with a precision that looked practiced. Then, with no words, he set 3 of the traps in shaded areas near the camp. Every action carried a rhythm, an unspoken assurance that he understood the environment better than the others. He returned, placed more leaves in his mouth, chewed, swallowed, and reached for the canteen again. The bitterness remained, but he drank as though it were no more dangerous than sour fruit. His silence pressed heavily on the others, who could no longer tell whether he ignored them out of confidence or pity. As midday arrived, the cadets grew more anxious. The Drevek, who had once smirked at the plan, now paced with restless claws, clearly torn between pride and guilt. The Osili could not keep still, fluffing her feathers again and again in nervous bursts. Even the Urvath, who rarely displayed emotion, shifted uneasily, her crystalline form refracting sunlight in sharp, restless angles. No one admitted the thought out loud, but every glance betrayed the same realization. If the human could drink poison with impunity, then he was not the weak link of the group. He was the axis around which their survival might turn. The human finally broke the silence near dusk. He did not speak words of accusation or boast of his resilience. Instead, he gestured toward the forest's edge and walked without looking back. The cadets followed, drawn by curiosity more than trust. He stopped near a patch of undergrowth, crouched, and pointed to a cluster of plants. His hand brushed over the leaves, his finger tracing the edges, and then he plucked one and held it up. He placed it in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed again. The cadets exchanged uncertain glances, realizing he was demonstrating something but not daring to ask what. He repeated the gesture with a second plant, this time pulling the leaves apart to show the fibrous veins. Again he chewed, swallowed, and wiped his hands clean on his trousers. The Drevek muttered under his breath that the human was toying with them, but his voice lacked conviction. As night descended, the tension shifted into unease tinged with respect. The cadets sat around the fire, but the warmth did little to thaw the cold edge of their thoughts. The human sat apart, his gaze fixed on the flames, his canteen beside him, still half full of poisoned water. He lifted it once more, drank, and set it down. His hand lingered briefly on the metal surface, and then he folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. The cadets knew then that the trial had changed. What had begun as a plot to expose weakness had instead revealed strength. The realization burned deeper than any shame. The human was not only surviving, but doing so with knowledge they did not yet understand. In the darkness, unease grew into something heavier, and the cadets found themselves watching him with a mixture of suspicion, confusion, and reluctant admiration. The silence no longer felt like anticipation of his failure. It felt like the beginning of his dominance. The night had been heavy with unspoken questions, and when dawn came, the cadets rose sluggishly, each one watching the human more closely than the day before. He had not faltered once despite drinking water laced with poison, and that unsettled them more than hunger or fatigue. By now, suspicion had shifted into a gnawing curiosity that none of them could quiet. Every movement he made was studied: how he stretched, how he checked the traps, how he chewed on unfamiliar plants as if he knew their purpose. The silence among the others had grown unbearable, so when the human finally knelt at the edge of the camp and began gathering weeds into a neat pile, every pair of eyes locked onto him with restless intensity. He crushed the leaves between his palms, releasing a pungent odor that stung the air. Then he scooped a pinch of ash from the remains of the fire and pressed it into the mash of green pulp. He rolled the mixture into a rough ball and set it on a flat stone. His movements were not rushed. They were deliberate, almost methodical, as though he followed a practiced routine. The Drevek muttered under his breath, claws flexing, as suspicion tightened around his pride. He had been certain the human should have collapsed, but instead the man seemed to be performing some ritual of immunity. The Osili leaned closer, feathers trembling with a mix of fear and fascination, while the crystalline Urvath stood still as a statue, refracting the dim light, but watching with unwavering focus. When the human lifted the ball of crushed weeds and ash to his mouth, the others gasped softly. He chewed with slow patience, his jaw working against the bitterness that contorted his mouth for a brief second. After swallowing, he exhaled sharply, as if clearing his throat of the harsh taste, and reached for more leaves to repeat the process. He did not explain what he was doing at first. He did not speak at all. But as he chewed, his eyes flicked toward the group of cadets who had gathered in an uncertain half-circle around him. There was a weight in his gaze, not angry, but deliberate, as if he wanted them to see and understand without words. It was the Osili who finally broke the silence. Her voice, normally sharp and commanding, trembled with hesitation. She asked him what purpose the plant served. The human paused mid-chew, then swallowed, wiped his hand against his trousers, and picked up one of the broad leaves from the pile. He held it between his fingers, showing the serrated edge and the thick veins running down the middle. Then he pointed to the black dust of charcoal still scattered on the stone. His voice was calm when he spoke, but firm, as though reciting instruction. He explained that toxins cling to carbon, that crushed charcoal binds them before they can pass deeper into the body. He said the bitterness of the leaf slowed the poison's spread, forcing it to linger long enough to be neutralized. His explanation was simple, clear, and grounded in certainty. The Drevek shook his head, insisting that such knowledge was impossible, that no cadet had been trained to counteract poisons in this way. But his protest was hollow, for the proof sat before him. The human, alive, steady, and explaining with the patience of a teacher. The crystalline Urvath tilted her head, light splitting across her angular features, and said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence carried more weight than the Drevek's denial. The Osili leaned forward and asked how he had known which plants to use. He answered that he had studied environments where survival demanded more than equipment, where one mistake meant death. He said Earth had many poisons, But Earth also had remedies, and humans learned quickly that knowledge could mean the difference between a shallow grave and another sunrise. Then he stood, walked to the stream, and knelt again. He dipped his hand into the water, lifted a handful of liquid to his lips, and drank. When he returned to the fire, he spat into his palm, revealing the faint green tint of the leaf he had chewed earlier. He pressed it into the dirt, grinding it flat, and told them that sometimes the cure grew beside the poison. He explained that in most environments nature balanced harm with remedy, and that those who looked closely enough could see the patterns. His words were not boastful. They were offered like lessons, fragments of knowledge freely shared. The Ocele's feathers rustled with unease. She asked him if the poison had harmed him at all. He answered with a faint smile, admitting that it had burned his stomach at first, but that the mixture of ash and leaf had dulled the edge. He tapped the side of his ribs lightly, as if to emphasize his endurance, and then shrugged, dismissing the discomfort as trivial. His composure unsettled the group further, for it was not the arrogance of one who flaunted superiority, but the quiet strength of one who had endured worse. By midday, the cadets could no longer pretend indifference. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst tightened their throats, and the memory of the poisoned canteen haunted their thoughts. The Drevek finally asked, his tone brittle, whether the antidote would work on his species as well. The human studied him carefully, then bent to gather more leaves. He crushed them, added charcoal dust, and handed the mixture to the Drevek without ceremony. The Drevek hesitated, claws twitching, but the weight of every watching eye forced him to accept. He swallowed, grimaced at the bitterness, and coughed once. No immediate harm followed. The Ocele stepped forward next, and then even the crystalline Irvath bent to take a portion of the mixture. One by one they followed, each uncertain but desperate enough to trust the human's knowledge. When the cadets sat again by the fire, the tension had shifted. Shame mingled with gratitude, suspicion with reluctant respect. The Drevek kept his gaze fixed on the ground, unwilling to admit what he felt, while the Ocele's feathers smoothed slightly, her body less tense. The Irvath remained still, but her head tilted toward the human with a hint of acknowledgement. The human himself said little more. He returned to chewing leaves, drinking from his canteen, and setting another snare at the edge of camp. But the unspoken truth settled among the cadets. He had discovered not only how to survive their sabotage, but also how to save them from the very weapon they had used against him. His discovery was not a shield for himself alone. It was knowledge he had placed in their hands, a gift none of them had earned, and that gift carried a weight heavier than any punishment could. As dusk fell again, the cadets no longer watched him with the eyes of conspirators. They watched him with the wary recognition that something had shifted. The human was no longer merely an outsider to be envied or sabotaged. He had become the one who understood the balance between death and survival, the one who had turned their cruelty into an opportunity to teach. His discovery had redrawn the lines of the trial, and the cadets felt, for the first time, that they were not just competing against him. They were learning from him, whether they admitted it or not. The mood in the camp shifted with the weight of the previous day's revelation. No one could deny that the human's knowledge had prevented disaster, and even the most stubborn cadets felt a pull they had not expected, a quiet, reluctant need to listen. When dawn returned, the air was damp with mist, and the fire smoldered low. The human rose first, as always, his movements measured and purposeful. He stretched, tightened the straps of his pack, and gathered a few sticks for the fire without asking for assistance. The others stirred slowly, watching him with tired eyes, waiting for a sign of what he would do next. It was the Ocele who finally spoke, her voice edged with unease. She admitted that she did not know how to recognize safe plants from deadly ones, and her feathers trembled slightly when she asked if he could show her. The human paused, studied her with a calm gaze, and then nodded once. Without ceremony, he walked toward the forest. His steps were quiet, but the cadets followed in a scattered line, compelled by the silent authority in his movements. He stopped near a cluster of bushes where broad leaves shimmered with dew. Kneeling, he touched one leaf gently, traced its edges with his fingers, and pointed out the distinct serration. He explained in a clear, steady voice that the veins ran in patterns unique to this plant, a sign that it carried compounds which slowed toxins in the blood. He then plucked a second leaf from a nearby plant with similar color but smoother edges, crushing it between his fingers to release a faint, acrid scent. He held it up and warned that the smell revealed its danger, that its use would accelerate poison rather than counter it. His demonstration was simple, yet it carried the weight of survival. The cadets leaned closer, eager despite themselves. The Drevek crouched low, narrowing his eyes as if trying to commit every vein and angle to memory. The crystalline Irvath stood tall but did not blink, absorbing every detail in silence. The Osili tilted her head sharply to one side, feathers quivering as she watched him chew a small piece of the safe leaf to prove his words. When he swallowed without hesitation, her doubt melted into reluctant belief. He spoke again, telling them that survival depended not on strength or cunning alone, but on recognition of patterns, on knowing how to read the environment instead of forcing it to obey. His words carried no boast, only the calm assurance of someone who had lived such lessons many times before. He then knelt by the dirt and drew simple lines with a stick. He sketched a stream, marked the patches of vegetation, and explained how water shaped the land, how plants closest to strong currents often carried less toxin, while stagnant pools bred sickness. He showed them where to set snares, where to search for edible roots, and how to identify insects that revealed whether a plant was safe. His hand moved steadily across the ground, turning dust into a map of survival. For the first time, the camp was quiet, not because of suspicion, but because every cadet listened. The Drevek clenched his jaw but did not interrupt. The Osili leaned so close that her feathers brushed the dirt. Even the Irvath's crystalline body tilted forward, her sharp edges catching light as if reflecting the knowledge into herself. As the day progressed, the human's role as teacher deepened. He guided them to a fallen log and showed how to strip its bark for fibers, weaving them into cords strong enough to build traps. He explained how knots should be tied with precision, not haste, and demonstrated by creating loops that held firm even when pulled with force. The Drevek tested one of the knots with his claws, expecting it to fail, but it held fast. The Drevek's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The Osili tried next, fumbling with her talons, and the human corrected her gently, showing how to fold the cord over itself. She tried again, slower this time, and managed a knot that held. A flicker of pride crossed her face before she quickly concealed it. The crystalline Irvath declined to try, but her gaze lingered longer than usual, betraying a quiet interest. By midday, the cadets had begun to mimic his habits. When he chewed leaves, the Osili gathered her own handful, testing their texture cautiously. When he adjusted a snare, the Drevek crouched beside him, pretending to criticize while clearly studying each movement. When he explained how to build a shelter by layering branches against a stone wall, the Irvath silently added her strength, lifting heavier pieces of wood than the others could manage. None of them admitted aloud that they were learning, but their actions betrayed the truth. In the afternoon, the human set another lesson into motion. He gathered a pile of stones near the fire and selected one with sharp edges. He held it high so the cadets could see and explained how stone tools had served his ancestors when metal was scarce. He struck one stone against another until sparks leapt into the air, catching in dry moss. The fire rekindled, crackling back to life, and the cadets leaned forward, mesmerized. The Osili whispered softly that she had believed only technology could grant such power, and the Drevek muttered in irritation that fire-making without tools was impossible. The human said nothing in response. He simply built the flames higher, letting the proof silence their doubts. As evening came, the cadets sat together in a circle, their gazes no longer hostile but uncertain in a new way. The Drevek's pride still bristled, but his claws rested quietly against his knees. The Ocili ruffled her feathers softly, less from agitation than from restless energy. The crystalline Irvath sat tall, her body reflecting the firelight in fractured beams, her silence more thoughtful than cold. The human sat among them, the Canteen beside him, his expression unchanged. He did not gloat, did not remind them of the sabotage that had nearly cost lives. Instead, he spoke once more, his voice steady and deliberate. He told them that knowledge was a weapon sharper than claws, stronger than crystalline armor, swifter than wings. He said that survival was not about defeating others, but about ensuring that none were left behind. The words settled heavily in the circle. The Drevek looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes, but his silence betrayed agreement he could not voice. The Ocili lowered her head slightly in acknowledgement, her feathers dimming as she considered his lesson. The Irvath remained still, but her gaze lingered on him longer than before, as though weighing his strength in a different light. That night, the camp no longer felt fractured. The cadets did not sleep in distant corners but gathered nearer the fire, their bodies angled unconsciously toward the human. The lesson had not erased envy or distrust, but it had planted something deeper: respect. He had transformed poison into instruction, sabotage into guidance, and suspicion into reluctant unity. What began as an attempt to break him had instead forged a teacher. And as the flames flickered across the camp, each cadet understood that survival in the trial no longer rested on individual pride, but on the knowledge of the one they had once sought to destroy. The final days of the survival trial arrived with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty of its beginning. The camp no longer pulsed with hostility or quiet plots, but with an uneasy, growing sense of unity. The cadets who once circled each other like predators had begun to move with a common rhythm, their actions subtly coordinated, their eyes often turned toward the human when decisions needed to be made. He had not demanded their attention, nor had he declared himself their leader. Instead, he had earned it piece by piece through demonstration, patience, and the quiet certainty that survival was not a contest, but a responsibility. When the last dawn stretched across the ridges, pale and cold, the cadets rose together. The Drevek, who once smirked with pride, now crouched beside the fire pit and gathered kindling without being asked. His claws, once restless with irritation, worked steadily as he built the base of the flames. The Ocili shook dew from her feathers and brought dry leaves for the fire, her movements deliberate, her eyes calmer than they had been since the start. The crystalline Irvath stood watch on the ridge, her body refracting the first rays of the sun into shards of light that illuminated the camp like scattered jewels. She did not speak, but her silent presence above them carried a weight of protection. The human moved quietly among them, checking snares, adjusting the shelter, and preparing the meager breakfast from roots and leaves he had foraged the day before. When he returned, the group formed an unspoken circle around the fire. No words were exchanged, yet there was a fragile harmony in the way they waited for him to begin. He crouched low, divided the food evenly, and handed each portion with deliberate care. No one complained about the bitterness or the size of the serving. The silence that followed was no longer charged with suspicion, but filled with respect that none of the cadets could bring themselves to voice. Later that morning, the sound of engines rolled through the valley. The extraction vessels approached with a low hum, their silver hulls gleaming in the rising sun. The cadets straightened, feathers twitching, claws flexing, crystalline edges catching the light. The trial was ending, and soon the instructors would descend to judge what had been accomplished. A ripple of unease moved through the group. Each cadet knew the truth. The trial had not unfolded as the instructors had expected. Rules had been broken, sabotage had been attempted, and failure had been all but certain, until the human had reshaped the course of events. The Drevek's pride bristled once more at the thought of admitting this. The Ocili shifted her wings nervously, aware that her role in the sabotage might come to light. Even the crystalline Irvath, who had neither plotted nor spoken much, felt the weight of silent complicity. None of them were certain how the human would respond when the instructors demanded their account. When the vessels landed, the instructors emerged in rigid formation. Their uniforms gleamed, their expressions hard, their eyes sharp with expectation. They approached the camp slowly, scanning the makeshift shelter, the circle of stones around the fire, and the small bundles of foraged supplies. It was clear from their expressions that they had anticipated disorder, perhaps even collapse. What they saw instead was a camp intact, a group seated together, and a fire burning steadily under the pale sky. Their gazes fixed quickly on the human, for he was the one sitting closest to the flames, his canteen at his side, his posture calm but unyielding. The lead instructor demanded a report, his voice carrying across the camp. The Drevek lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening as silence held him captive. The Ocili shuffled her wings and stared at the dirt. The crystalline Irvath stood still, refracting sunlight but saying nothing. It was the human who rose slowly, brushed the dust from his trousers, and stepped forward. His voice was steady when he spoke. He did not accuse, did not expose the sabotage, did not recount the bitterness of poisoned water or the fear it had caused. Instead, he described how the cadets had learned to read the environment, how they had gathered food, built shelter, and worked together. He emphasized not the cruelty of the beginning, but the unity of the end. His words carried no anger, only the quiet conviction of someone who understood that survival was not measured by grudges, but by growth. The instructors listened with expressions carved from stone. Some narrowed their eyes as if expecting deception. Others glanced toward the cadets for confirmation. The Drevek raised his head slowly, claws trembling, and gave a sharp nod. The Ocili ruffled her feathers once before bowing her head in agreement. Even the crystalline Irvath, whose silence had often masked her thoughts, tilted her faceted head toward the human in acknowledgement. The instructors exchanged brief glances, surprised perhaps by the unexpected unity of the group. When the report concluded, the lead instructor turned to the cadets and demanded if anyone wished to add to the account. The silence that followed was heavy, but not shameful. It was the silence of agreement. None spoke of poison or betrayal, because the conclusion of the trial had transformed those acts into something different. What had begun as an attempt to weaken one had ended as a lesson that strengthened all. To expose the past would have been to betray the growth that had followed. The instructors marked their notes and gave the order for departure. The cadets gathered their meager belongings and followed toward the vessels. As the engines roared to life, the group moved as one, not scattered individuals, but a fragile unit forged through trial. The Drevek walked near the human, his posture less defiant, his claws no longer drumming with irritation. The Ocili walked close as well, her feathers folded tight, her eyes glancing toward the human with something approaching gratitude. The crystalline Irvath moved silently beside them, her angular form casting sharp light across the human's shoulder as if to frame him with her acknowledgement. When the vessel doors closed and the camp disappeared beneath them, the cadets sat in silence once more. But the silence no longer carried hostility or fear. It carried something heavier, something more lasting: respect. Each cadet understood in a different way what the human had done. He had turned poison into knowledge, sabotage into lesson, and distrust into reluctant unity. He had chosen not to expose the cruelty of the past, but to highlight the strength of the present. And in doing so, he had ensured that the trial ended not with bitterness, but with understanding. When the vessel docked at the academy and the cadets were dismissed, the instructors offered no praise and no condemnation. They merely recorded that the group had survived. Yet survival was not the full story. The cadets knew it, and so did the human. For each one of them, the memory of those bitter leaves, of charcoal dust, of knots tied under patient guidance would remain. The Drevek would never forget how knowledge had outmatched his pride. The Osili would never forget how survival had been taught not through dominance, but through demonstration. The crystalline Irvath would never forget the calm presence of the human who spoke little but revealed much. The human walked away without seeking recognition. His stride was steady, his expression unchanged. He had no need for applause, because he understood that true respect was not granted by instructors or written in reports. It was carried in the eyes of those who had once despised him and now watched him leave with a quiet reverence they could not voice. He had not won a trial, he had transformed it. And though no celebration marked his achievement, the silence that followed him was its own reward. It was the silence of respect earned, respect that would not be forgotten.